It all began with a postcard, a simple vintage postcard that arrived in Elizabeth's mailbox 1 week before Christmas. The card showed a cheerful Christmas village, its snow-covered streets lined with glowing lanterns. But what caught Elizabeth's attention wasn't the idyllic scene. It was the scrawled message on the back. "Don't come back. The carols aren't what they seem." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she turned the card over. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Aunt May. It was impossible. Aunt May had died 5 years ago. Elizabeth stood on her porch, the cold December wind nipping at her face. She stared at the postcard, her mind reeling. Her hometown of Snowbrook had always been a place of warmth and tradition, but Aunt May's warning planted a seed of unease. She had planned to spend Christmas in Snowbrook after years of being away. Now doubt clouded her excitement, but curiosity won. By the next evening, Elizabeth was packed and on her way. The snow fell steadily as she drove through winding roads, the GPS guiding her deeper into the countryside. She arrived at Snowbrook under the veil of night. The town looked just as she remembered. Quaint houses adorned with twinkling lights, wreaths on every door, and the faint sound of carolers drifting through the air. Yet there was something off. The streets were deserted. No children playing in the snow, no bustling holiday shoppers, and the carolers she heard. They were nowhere to be seen. The melodies seemed to echo from every corner, yet had no source. Elizabeth parked in front of her childhood home. The house stood in darkness, its windows blank and lifeless. She stepped out into the biting cold and carried her suitcase to the door, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The key she had never failed. The door creaked open, and the familiar scent of pine and cinnamon greeted her. "Home, sweet home," she whispered, flipping the light switch. The old chandelier above flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced across the living room. Elizabeth took a deep breath. Whatever was bothering her, she would shake it off. Tomorrow she'd decorate, bake cookies, and rekindle the Christmas spirit. That night, Elizabeth's dreams were filled with discordant carols and shadowy figures. She woke in a sweat, the sound of faint singing still lingering in her ears. Her clock read 3:07 a.m. She tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to stress. But as she glanced out her bedroom window, her breath caught. A group of figures stood in the snow right in front of her house. They were dressed in Victorian-style caroler outfits, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move, didn't sing. They just stood there, staring up at her window. Elizabeth's heart raced. She grabbed her phone, but the screen remained blank, no matter how many times she pressed the buttons. No signal, no power. She looked back out the window. The figures were gone. By morning, the incident felt like a bad dream. But when Elizabeth stepped outside, she saw footprints in the snow leading to her porch. Her heart sank. They stopped right at her door. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Elizabeth visited the town square. The place was just as eerily quiet as the night before. She spotted a few townsfolk and approached an elderly man sitting on a bench. "Excuse me, sir. What's going on here? Where is everyone?" The man looked at her with glassy eyes. "They're here." "Who's here?" she pressed. He leaned in, his voice a whisper. "The carolers. They come every year, but they're not what they seem. Don't let them in." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Before she could ask more, the man stood and shuffled away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She decided to visit the town archives, hoping to find some clue about the strange events. The library was empty, save for the librarian, a woman with a nervous disposition. When Elizabeth explained her concerns, the librarian hesitated, then pulled out an old, dusty book. "The Silent Carol," she said, placing it on the table. "It's an old legend. Some say it's true." Elizabeth opened the book and began reading. The story spoke of a group of carolers who, centuries ago, were caught in a blizzard outside Snowbrook. Desperate for shelter, they knocked on doors, but the villagers, fearing strangers, turned them away. The carolers perished in the snow, their voices silenced forever. Since then, the legend claimed, they returned every Christmas to seek vengeance, singing their haunting carols to lure victims. "If you hear them," the librarian whispered, "don't answer, and whatever you do, don't invite them in." That night, Elizabeth prepared for the worst. She locked every door and window and turned off all the lights. The house was plunged into darkness as she sat in the living room, gripping a fireplace poker. The hours dragged on, and just as she began to think she was safe, the singing began. It was soft at first, a gentle hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then it grew louder, harmonizing voices rising in a chilling crescendo. Elizabeth's breath quickened. She peeked through the curtains. The carolers were back, standing in the snow, their faces still hidden. They began moving toward the house. A loud knock echoed through the air. Elizabeth froze. The knock came again, louder this time. Then came the voices. "Let us in, Elizabeth." Her blood turned to ice. They knew her name. "We're cold. Let us in." Elizabeth clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The singing grew louder, the knocking more insistent. She felt her resolve slipping, an unnatural pull, urging her to open the door. "No," she whispered to herself. "It's not real." Suddenly the front door rattled as if something was trying to force it open. Elizabeth screamed, backing away. The lights flickered, and a chilling wind blew through the house, extinguishing the fireplace. She felt a presence behind her and turned, expecting to see one of them. But there was nothing. The knocking stopped. The singing faded. Silence fell over the house. Elizabeth stood trembling in the darkness, unsure if she had survived the night. Then a soft voice whispered in her ear, "Merry Christmas." The next morning, the townsfolk found Elizabeth's house empty. The doors were locked, the windows unbroken. But in the snow outside, there was a new set of footprints, leading away from the house and vanishing into the woods. No one ever saw Elizabeth again. And the carolers. They still come every year, their haunting melodies echoing through Snowbrook, waiting for someone to invite them in. Maggie O'Connor's life had been quiet since she moved to Pine Hollow, a small town nestled in the mountains. She rented a modest cabin surrounded by snow-dusted evergreens and spent her days painting and tending to her dog, Max. Christmas was her favorite season, and this year she planned to spend it peacefully, just the two of them. 3 days before Christmas, a package arrived on her doorstep. Maggie hadn't ordered anything, and the box had no return address. It was wrapped in thick red paper with a golden bow. She carried it inside, curious and slightly unnerved. Max growled low in his throat, his hackles rising as she set the box on the table. "What's wrong, boy?" Maggie asked, scratching his ears. He only stared at the package, his tail tucked between his legs. Maggie's curiosity got the better of her. She carefully peeled away the paper and opened the box. Inside was an antique snow globe, its glass slightly cloudy. She held it up to the light, admiring the miniature scene inside. A quaint Victorian home, surrounded by a snowy forest, just like her own cabin. Tiny figures of a man, a woman, and a child stood outside the house, frozen in a moment of holiday cheer. She shook the globe and flakes of fake snow swirled around. But when the snow settled, Maggie's heart skipped a beat. The figures inside had moved. The man was now standing at the edge of the forest, his tiny face turned toward her. "That's odd," she muttered, placing the globe back in the box. She tried to dismiss the unease creeping into her mind, chalking it up to a trick of the light. That night, Maggie dreamed of the snow globe. She saw the tiny family moving within it, their actions frantic and desperate. The man waved his arms as if trying to get her attention. She woke in a cold sweat, Max whining at her bedside. The clock read 3:13 a.m. Unable to shake the strange dream, Maggie went to the living room. The snow globe sat on the table where she'd left it. This time there were only two figures, the woman and the child. The man was gone. A knock sounded at the door. Maggie froze. Who would visit at this hour, especially in the middle of a snowstorm? She crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. No one was there, just the wind howling through the trees. She turned back to the snow globe. Her breath hitched. A tiny dark figure now stood in the forest inside the globe, half hidden among the trees. Its eyes seemed to glint in the dim light. Over the next 2 days, strange things began happening. Maggie found wet footprints leading from the front door to the snow globe, despite not having left the house. At night she heard faint whispers, as though someone was standing just outside her window. Max's behavior grew worse. He barked at empty corners and refused to leave her side. On Christmas Eve, Maggie decided she'd had enough. She packed the snow globe back into its box and drove to the nearest town to dispose of it. She stopped at a thrift store and left it on a shelf, hoping someone else might take it far away. But as she drove back home, her car's headlights caught a glint of glass on the passenger seat. The snow globe was back. Maggie screamed, swerving the car to a stop. She threw open the door and hurled the globe into the woods. It shattered against a tree, the sound oddly muffled by the snow. She sat in her car, panting, trying to calm her racing heart. When she finally returned home, the cabin was dark and quiet. She locked every door and window, praying the ordeal was over. At midnight, Maggie woke to the sound of shattering glass. She grabbed a flashlight and crept into the living room. The snow globe sat on the table, whole again. This time, all three figures were gone. A loud banging erupted from the front door, shaking it on its hinges. Maggie's flashlight flickered as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Max growled, his fur standing on end, but he refused to go near the door. "Who's there?" Maggie called, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. A voice, low and gravelly, answered, "You invited us." The door burst open, and the storm outside surged into the room, extinguishing the lights. In the swirling snow, Maggie saw them, 3 shadowy figures, their eyes glowing faintly. They moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching as they stepped inside. Maggie backed away, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Stay away!" she screamed. The figures didn't stop. The largest one, the man, reached out with a hand that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Max lunged, barking furiously, but the man swatted him aside with inhuman strength. Maggie's heart broke as Max let out a yelp and went still. The figures surrounded her, their presence suffocating. The woman leaned in, her voice a cold whisper. "You broke the globe. Now we're free." Maggie's scream was swallowed by the storm. The next morning, Pine Hollow was blanketed in fresh snow. Maggie's cabin stood silent, its windows dark. A passing neighbor stopped by to check on her, but found the house empty. There was no sign of Maggie or Max, only the faint sound of wind chimes echoing through the trees. Later that day, a family shopping at the thrift store picked up an antique snow globe. They admired the tiny Victorian scene inside, a quaint cabin surrounded by a snowy forest. 3 figures stood outside the house, a man, a woman, and a child. And now there was a 4th figure, a woman holding a flashlight, her face frozen in a silent scream. Christmas Eve was always a special time for the Carter family. Their house in the small town of Brindlewood was a beacon of holiday cheer, with glowing lights, a towering tree in the living room, and the smell of fresh cookies wafting through the air. This year was no different. Evelyn Carter sat on the couch with her teenage daughter, Lily, sipping hot cocoa while her husband, Mark, added the finishing touches to the outdoor decorations. "Dad always goes overboard," Lily said with a laugh, watching him wrestle with a tangled string of lights. "It's tradition," Evelyn replied, smiling. "And you know how much he loves making this place look perfect." As the clock ticked closer to midnight, they decided to call it a night. Mark came inside, his cheeks flushed from the cold. The family gathered around the tree, exchanging stories and laughter before heading to bed. But something felt off that night. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She dismissed it as holiday stress and went to bed, telling herself she was imagining things. The sound of faint knocking woke Evelyn at exactly 12:15 a.m. She sat up, straining to hear. The knocking came again, soft but deliberate, echoing through the quiet house. She nudged Mark awake. "Someone's at the door," she whispered. Mark groaned but got up, pulling on his robe. Evelyn followed him downstairs, her heart pounding. When they reached the front door, Mark peered through the peephole. "No one's there," he said, unlocking the door and opening it cautiously. The snowy front yard was empty. The neighborhood was silent, the only sound the distant howl of the wind. Mark shrugged and closed the door, bolting it for good measure. "Probably kids playing pranks," he muttered, heading back upstairs. Evelyn wasn't so sure. She lingered in the living room, staring at the Christmas tree, its lights casting a warm glow. She was about to head back to bed when she noticed something. One of the ornaments was missing. She frowned, searching the tree. It had been there earlier, a delicate glass angel her grandmother had given her. She looked around the floor, thinking it might have fallen, but it was nowhere to be found. Unease settled in her chest, but she forced herself to let it go. "It's just an ornament," she told herself, turning off the lights and heading upstairs. At 2:30 a.m., the knocking returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. Evelyn bolted upright in bed, her heart racing. She shook Mark awake again. "It's happening again," she whispered. Mark sighed, clearly annoyed, but got up. Together they went downstairs. Evelyn held her breath as Mark opened the door. Again, there was no one there, but this time something was different. A single footprint was etched into the snow on the porch. It was impossibly large, far bigger than any human foot, with long, claw-like toes. Evelyn felt a chill crawl down her spine. "What the hell is that?" Mark muttered, stepping back inside and locking the door. He tried to laugh it off, but Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound. When morning finally came, she felt a sense of relief. Whatever had happened, it was over, or so she thought. When the family gathered around the tree to open presents, Evelyn's unease returned. The missing ornament wasn't the only thing out of place. A new package sat under the tree, wrapped in plain brown paper. None of them had put it there. "What's that?" Lily asked, reaching for the box. "Don't touch it," Evelyn said sharply, surprising even herself. She approached the package cautiously. There was no tag, no writing of any kind. Against her better judgment, she opened it. Inside was the missing glass angel. But it wasn't the same. The once pristine ornament was now cracked and stained, as though it had been buried in dirt for years. Evelyn's hands trembled as she held it up. That's when she noticed the note tucked inside the box. "We liked your decorations. See you tonight." Panic set in. Evelyn showed the note to Mark, who tried to calm her down. "It's just a sick joke," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll stay up tonight, keep watch. No one's getting into this house." They spent the day preparing. Mark reinforced the locks and set up motion sensor lights outside. Evelyn kept Lily close, refusing to let her out of her sight. As night fell, the house became a fortress. At midnight, the knocking returned. This time it came from multiple directions. The front door, the back door, even the windows. Mark grabbed a baseball bat, his face pale but determined. Evelyn clutched Lily, her heart hammering in her chest. "Stay here," Mark said, moving towards the front door. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. The motion sensor lights outside flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows across the windows. Evelyn held her breath as Mark opened the door. Nothing. The porch was empty, but the snow was disturbed, as though dozens of people had been walking in circles around the house. "Mark, close the door!" Evelyn shouted. Before he could react, the living room window shattered. A freezing gust of wind blew through the house, extinguishing the lights. In the darkness, Evelyn saw them, shadowy figures slipping through the broken window, their forms barely human. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the night. Mark swung the bat, but it passed through the figures as if they were made of smoke. One of them lunged at him, and he crumpled to the floor, motionless. Evelyn screamed, pulling Lily toward the stairs. They ran to the bedroom and locked the door. Evelyn pushed a dresser in front of it. Her hands shaking, she clutched Lily tightly, whispering that everything would be okay, though she didn't believe it. The whispers started then, low and guttural, seeping through the walls. The door rattled, the figures scratching and pounding from the other side. Evelyn closed her eyes, praying for it to end. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. When morning came, the house was silent. Evelyn cautiously opened the door. The living room was a wreck, the tree toppled, the presents scattered. Mark was gone. In the middle of the room sat the glass angel, its cracks now gone. It gleamed in the morning light, pristine once more. A new note lay beside it. "Thanks for letting us in. See you next year." For as long as anyone could remember, the townsfolk of Winter Haven celebrated Christmas with a festival unlike any other. Every December, the town square transformed into a winter wonderland, with twinkling lights, steaming cups of cider, and carolers in Victorian costumes. But the main attraction was always the towering Santa Claus statue that stood at the center of the square. At 12 feet tall, the statue was an imposing figure, carved from wood and painted with intricate detail. It depicted a jolly Santa, his red suit vibrant and his eyes twinkling. But as cheerful as it seemed, the statue carried a dark legend. Town elders whispered that the statue wasn't just a decoration, but a guardian, a warning to keep an ancient, malevolent spirit at bay. Of course, no one really believed those stories, not until the year the statue disappeared. It started on a cold December morning. Evelyn Grayson, the festival coordinator, arrived early to oversee the final preparations. As she walked into the square, she froze. The spot where the Santa statue had stood for decades was empty. Evelyn's first thought was vandalism. She called the mayor and the sheriff, who quickly organized a search. But no one could explain how a 12-foot wooden statue had vanished overnight. There were no drag marks, no footprints in the snow. Nothing to suggest it had been moved at all. The festival went on as planned, but the absence of the statue cast a shadow over the event. Evelyn noticed the townsfolk whispering in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously around the square. She overheard snippets of conversation. The stories were true. Without the statue, what's going to happen? It's just a coincidence, Evelyn told herself, brushing off the rumors. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the snowstorm rolled in. Evelyn sat by her fireplace, sipping tea and trying to distract herself with a book. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. She was about to head to bed when she heard it, a faint knocking at the front door. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Evelyn hesitated. The storm was fierce, and no one in their right mind would be out in such weather. The knocking came again, louder this time. She grabbed her robe and cautiously approached the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just darkness and swirling snow. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. No one was there, but just as she was about to close the door, she noticed something in the snow. A single large boot print, far too large to belong to any normal person. The shape of it sent a chill down her spine. It looked almost inhuman. She slammed the door and bolted it, her heart racing. She told herself it was just her imagination, but sleep eluded her that night. The next morning, Evelyn went to the town square to check on the festival. The storm had passed, leaving the streets blanketed in fresh snow. As she approached, she noticed a group of people gathered near the center of the square, their faces pale and stricken. "What's going on?" she asked, pushing through the crowd. Her breath caught in her throat. In the middle of the square, where the statue once stood, was a new figure. It wasn't the cheerful Santa they'd all known, but something far darker. The figure was carved from the same wood, but its features were twisted and grotesque. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth contorted into a sinister grin. The red suit was tattered, streaked with black stains that resembled soot. Most unsettling of all, its hands were outstretched, as though reaching for something. The sheriff arrived moments later, but no one could explain where the statue had come from or who had placed it there. Evelyn felt a growing sense of dread. The air around the square seemed colder, heavier, as if the new statue carried a malevolent presence. That night, Evelyn's phone rang. It was Sheriff Jacobs. We have a problem," he said, his voice shaky. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, gripping the phone tightly. "The statue. It moved." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean it moved? It's not in the square anymore. We found it outside my office, and it's different." Evelyn didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her coat and drove to the sheriff's office. When she arrived, she saw the statue standing in the parking lot. Its pose had changed. The hands, once outstretched, were now clenched into fists. Its head was tilted as if watching something. "This isn't possible," Evelyn whispered. Sheriff Jacobs nodded grimly. "We're locking it up. Hopefully that'll keep it from whatever it's doing." They moved the statue into the station's basement and locked the door. But Evelyn knew it wouldn't be enough. By Christmas Eve, the town was on edge. Reports of strange occurrences spread like wildfire. Doors opening on their own, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, and that faint, ominous knocking heard at countless homes. Evelyn stayed home that night, barricading herself inside. But as the clock struck midnight, the knocking began. This time, it wasn't at the door, but at the windows. All of them. She clutched a kitchen knife, her heart pounding. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then came the whispers, low and guttural, speaking words she couldn't understand. The lights flickered, then went out completely. In the darkness, she saw it. The statue was inside her house, standing in the corner of the living room. Its head turned slowly, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. Evelyn screamed, but no sound came out. The statue's grin widened as it stepped toward her, its wooden joints creaking. She backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The next morning, the townsfolk found Evelyn's house empty. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of a struggle. But in the center of the town square, the twisted Santa statue had returned. This time, there was a new figure carved beside it, a woman, her face frozen in a silent scream. The townsfolk decided to end the festival that year. The Santa statue was burned, its ashes scattered far away. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every Christmas, the whispers returned, reminding Winter Haven that some traditions should never be forgotten.